A very good evening. Thank you all very much for coming. There are not many people who have a very real first-hand account of Cornell. We interviewed as many as we could for the catalogue. I interviewed many people years ago when I worked on the catalogue raisonné of Art of the Century gallery, Peggy Guggenheim's art gallery in New York that Frederick Kiesler designed. Interviewed a lot of people then, but so it's a great privilege. You know, you're among friends and family here. You have your Vienna fan club here this evening. And normally when you invite 50 people for a talk, you think that only 30 will say yes. And we invited 50 people and 50 people said yes. Oh, this never happens. So this is all for you.
Do you need to say any of this in German?
I think we're going to stay in English tonight, if that's okay for everybody. It would be a little easier for us, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Even if somebody called Schneemann should be able to speak some good German. I think we should maybe just start right at the beginning.
Okay.
I'm very curious about how you first met Joseph Cornell, in what circumstances, through whom you met him, and what your understanding of Cornell was before you met, how aware you were of him and what he was doing, how he was considered in the New York milieu at the time, and what your sort of responses were to him as an individual, because he was a very particular type of, well, a very unique character.
Unique. How does this turn on? I don't know this
you're
microphone.
I'm
on?
Yeah.
I guess, yes, it's true, he's on, yeah, yeah. Joseph was more than unique, he was utterly rare, and I was just out of university from Illinois, coming to New York City. My partner from all those years, James Tenney, the composer, conductor, was a young guy from Colorado, whose best friend in Colorado was Stan Brakhage. And so it was with Stan that we shared culture. We didn't really enter it, we didn't know the dimensions of it. But Stan was working with Cornell through his friend Larry Jordan. And so the first understanding I had of Cornell's work was through the films, the beautiful, subtle film that Brakhage was working on with Joseph. I didn't have a cultural context for Cornell. But what Stan told me was that Joseph liked to have not really assistants, but young women who would come and appear as if they might become an assistant. But that was part of a fantasy. And I understood a little bit that he was very mystical and fragile in his habits, and that I was to wear a ballerina skirt and little slippers and have my hair down and not say anything about my work.
And this was a suggestion of Cornell himself, or from somebody that knew him that suggested you should?
No, the complexity of Cornell has to do with his extreme sensitivity, his visionary compulsions and obsessions. He was also phobic and very fearful of sexuality. He didn't like to be touched. You couldn't possibly bring any visceral information to him. All things female were taboo, but all things feminine and childlike and innocent were part of his obsession and necessity for contact and dreaming.
It's really interesting you say that, the difference between the feminine and the female, because I have the impression, having been buried very deep in Cornell's work for a number of years now, that he worshipped women to a almost unhealthy extent. I mean, he had such enormous respect. He idolized women. And we talked earlier about the longing and the yearning. And it wasn't just for women, it was for travel, it was for far off places, it was for, and this sense of unrequitedness, which kind of permeates his whole work. It's not that he maybe would have enjoyed the end target, but he enjoyed the process of yearning for that something.
But I would say it wasn't for women at all, that women were terrifying and fearsome creatures, as his mother was, but it was for the girl, someone innocent and where he could project his own need for innocence and asexuality, for longing and sensuous feeling that would be in delicate materials, but never in an embodied body.
Okay, we're getting into the really heavy stuff straight away. I thought we were going to get to this a little bit later, but we'll just go straight in. No, we'll get to it straight now. Because this was inevitable that this was going to happen. Because this is, on the face of it, your friendship with him is, when we look at it now, years later, it appears to be an extremely unlikely friendship. There are obvious moments where your interests and fascinations and things chime and come together, but the divergence in the expression that your works take at a certain point is quite vast. I mean, you think also of his great friendship with Yayoi Kusama as being an equally unlikely alliance somehow. But just going back to the very beginning when you met him, did you understand, did he want a friend? Did he want a correspondent? Was it clear to you that he wanted someone to help him in the studio to tidy things up and organize things? Did you have a clear job description at the beginning?
Yes, but it always shifted constantly. He really was most happy when we were sitting in his little garden outside of his very ordinary house in Queens, New York, and he would prepare, or have his mother, the dominant, scary mother, prepare a lunch of 2 sardines, a sprig of parsley, a slice of lemon, and pink lemonade. And I was very hungry in those days, and maybe a cracker or 2. So all the young women that I knew who would go to be possible assistants had the ritual of this tiny little lunch. And Joseph would concentrate on a poetics of the weather, the birds, what he was reading, if it was Mallarmé, or something about bird and insect interrelationship, or something about the young woman at the bakery in the town where he would like to have gotten some biscuits, but he couldn't go that day because the weather was wrong. Everything was highly, highly sensitized, but to be in his mind with him was magic.
And was he very open with you from the beginning, or was there a process of warming up in terms of how much he disclosed, in terms of the intimacy of the type of things he was sharing with you and what he was asking questions with you about yourself? Because everything you read about him, he seemed to be incredibly shy. And you know, there's occasions where he would meet someone, a woman, and would just sort of hyperventilate and run away, like a child. He couldn't, like a sort of teenager in the first throes of puberty. But did you take some time to warm up with him, or was he a kind of open book to you right from the beginning?
Joseph didn't warm up. He was emaciated. He barely ate. He was in his world. In order to make this work, he had to maintain a very fragile psychic balance with invisible forces. And the most invisible of them were anything sexual or visceral, that all had to be recomposed and contained and given its own nature and its own spirit and its own quality of evanescent elusiveness. So you never really felt you were close, but I would be in very intense conversation an intense presence. And we would talk on the phone. When he wanted to phone me, it could be a conversation for several hours. I made sure everything stopped. And it would be a language of subtle travel from inner sensation states of mind, many of which offered this realm of longing, but made it impossible for him to get on the subway and come to New York City, even though he might want to do that, or made it impossible for him to ever ask me what I did. It took many years before he could have any idea of what my work was, and I knew that was a danger, and I never proposed it. Although at some point we began to exchange a fascination with the nude figure. And at some point, Joseph wanted to come to my studio in New York City where we would draw each other naked. And that was discussed at great length to the extent that I thought maybe that had happened.
As in, you talked about it so much that it became real somehow.
Yeah.
What were the concrete tasks that he was asking you to do in the studio? Because at the beginning, when you see his work, he's an incredibly solitary character. He works, I mean, we have the owl from Jasper Johns' collection behind us, and it's a type of self-portrait because Cornell always worked at night at the beginning, like a night owl at the kitchen table. And it was when his mother had gone to sleep and his handicapped brother had gone to sleep, and he worked alone.
Yeah.
And even the films he's making at the beginning are very solo things. And the time that you met him later in his career, there's a film which normally plays in this little room here, which we're going to open after the talk. We thought it would be a little bit distracting now. That's one of the Stan Brakhage films. Gdynia read now of the L train, which took him from Brooklyn into Manhattan. It's interesting that later in his career, he goes back to film, but he goes back to film as a director, asking Larry Jordan, Stan Brakhage, Rudy Burkhardt to make films according to his instructions. Yeah. And he would never have allowed someone in the studio early in his career. And it was only later, around the time that you met him, that, was it a sense that he needed help? Or he was interested in, he was maybe secure enough in his own language and artistic career that he could open himself to other conversations and other, I mean, it's a difficult question to ask you because you didn't know him maybe in the 1930s, but it seems that there was a collaborative burst at the end of his career where he had studio assistants and he worked with other filmmakers.
What year is that?
From the mid-50s until he died. So the last 15 years of his life, maybe.
So I mean, what was he had assistants, real ones?
He had real assistants at the end. You wouldn't consider yourself a real assistant?
No, I was one of the false assistants. Also, Joseph was very keen that we didn't know about each other, even though he asked me to recommend young dancers from the Judson Dance Theater who might come and also be false assistants. So my tasks initially were to look at materials that were overwhelming him. For instance, piles of newspapers, stacks and stacks of clippings and old newspapers. So I was interested. I had been the archivist for Edgar Varese as a way of Varese keeping my partner and myself alive with a little income. So I was keen for the newspapers, and I would start going through them looking for any reference to Joseph's themes, birds, water, poetry, or his contemporaries. And at one point, I'd have all these piles on the floor, and I found a drawing by Rauschenberg that said, you know, for Joseph. And I thought, this is very exciting, and it shouldn't be in this pile of newspapers that could be burnt up at any moment. And I said, look what I found, look what I found. And he said, oh no, put that away. I can't look at that. I don't want to see that. Put that back where you found it. So I did, and that's how the assistantship kind of regulated itself.
So he wanted help, but he absolutely didn't want help at the same time.
I would think so. It was like that. There were stages where someone could come in and work with some beads or some feathers, and that was when you went into the garage. But I was always in the house. And
late in his career, he had real assistants, and when he died in 1972, there were a lot of unfinished boxes in the studio, which were then finished by his studio assistants. And they've gone out into the world, and nobody has yet made a judgment call about these works. There's about 40 or 50.
I make a judgment call every time I see them.
Right. And actually anyone that knows his work is making a judgment call when they look at them. We chose not to have any of them in the exhibition because there will be a catalogue raisonné in about 10 years, and we didn't want this exhibition to be posthumously discredited. So we didn't include them, but it's a problematic thing because he was never operating a sort of Andy Warhol type studio, but there were definitely people that he was asking to cut things out, put them in. He would bake the boxes in the kitchen oven, cook them to make them look older, to get this kind of cracking effect, and they were cooking the boxes, and there were some that when he died, they were obviously in very early stages, and those assistants took it upon themselves to finish them. But were you getting involved in the physical architecture of any boxes or collages? Were you?
He would show me the groups of materials, like certain feathers, or beads, or pieces of wood, or little balls, things that were going to go into the work. But I never had a physical task to do with them. I would look at them and study them, and sometimes make sure that all the beads were together and all the feathers were together, but I wasn't involved in any construction as such.
And you were painting yourself at this time, right?
I was also making boxes, but I was making boxes that were being set on fire and blown up. So his influence was mystical and magical, but I couldn't, in my own work, establish that degree of containment and stability and
the stillness.
Longing,
and the stillness is something which I see as a major difference between the two of you in the work. That you have a restlessness and I mean, he was. Having said that, when I think about it, you're both equally interested in changes of state, albeit in extremely different ways.
Well, he constructs and stabilizes the changes of state, and I blow them up and shred them and chew them and hammer them into another form.
And I mean, when one reads about some of your early work and the early boxes, some art historians refer to Cornell as being some form of influence on what you were doing. Someone even goes so far as to say they were homages to Cornell. I don't personally see that.
Neither do I.
You don't?
No.
Okay,
No.
I'm good. Because
Rauschenberg would be a more likely influence.
Right.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think Cornell was a huge influence on Rauschenberg. So maybe Cornell's influence on you was somehow second-hand via the work. I mean, Rauschenberg, his early career of the whole combines and the assemblage, they could never have happened without a lot of this work. And Jasper says the same thing, that he was so influential. So when your own artistic career is, when you're at art school in Illinois, are you ever hearing the name Joseph Cornell? Is he part of any discussions that you're having with artist friends and?
Maybe. Well, certainly with Brackage, and Stan was moving from Denver, stopping in Illinois, and then going to New York City, because, as most of you know, his philosophy was that the only way he could be educated into the rigors of art was that he cared about was if he went and met the artist and moved in with them, tried to live with them, which he did.
So, you knew Cornell for around 13 years, from 56, 56. You're 17 years old when you meet him. He's around 52. Which for Cornell was a completely normal age gap in friendships. I mean, he had friendships with people who were much younger than you. Their mothers were always a little concerned. And how supportive was he when your own career? I mean, there's a story that when you had your first solo exhibition in Minetta Lane, was that one of your earlier shows? That he was trying to drum up support and get people to come, and Deborah Solomon writes about this in Cornell's biography, that he was a cheerleader for you when you were taking your first steps. Does that...
I don't remember any of that at all. I do remember that very, very gradually some of the images from iBody, the naked self-transformations within the painting sculptures, that a few of them were collaged enough that I thought he would want to see them. And then he became very interested in the way that nudity could be magical and mystical and not erotically threatening. But I had to nourish that possibility with very gentle and rather obscure or indirect imagery. And that might be when he began to include a few naked images in his work. Women, naked women.
There's one right here actually behind you, which is
beautiful.
the most obvious example in the show. And it's interesting because this is a naked woman lying in a landscape, which reminds you incredibly of Étant Donné and that sort of thing. But for Cornell, this is all about Goethe.
Yeah.
So he's taking a contemporary photograph from Life magazine of a naked young woman lying in a forest, but for him it's all coming back to old German literature.
Yeah.
So even these more openly erotic things for him were anchored in something older, more profound. I don't know if it was a way of... It's interesting, when we opened the show, we had reviews from all of the main newspapers, and most of them were pretty good. But one review and one journalist, and I've had many conversations with her since, she can't get beyond his biography. It gets in the way of looking at the objects for her. And she found his relationship with women actually profoundly disturbing. And I've asked myself this question many times: if Cornell lived now with society, with our rules of society and our phobias and our, you know, we live in a very different time now than New York in the 1950s and 60s in terms of letting children out the door to play, and it's obviously an impossible game to play, but I happen to think we would have judged Cornell much more harshly by the standards of our life today than perhaps the time that he was alive. That his fascination with the young girl in the diner and what he would write in his diary about, you know, the lovely porcelain legs of the 8-year-old girl that he saw on the subway train. And I mean, you read the biography and it's really difficult to stomach somehow. But here you are as a beautiful 17-year-old with your little tutu and your ballet pumps. Did you ever feel uneasy and threatened in his presence, or was he paternal?
No, I had to be careful not to threaten him.
Right.
In order to maintain the sweetness of our mystical discussions. Because Cornell was very dark. Under this sentimentality is this haunting absence of vital erotics and absence of sort of a rigorous healthiness. I have letters, a long letter handwritten from him in which he describes a bicycle accident that injures him sexually. So that's part of some mystery that I don't know if it's ever been unraveled or looked at further. His deepest loving relationship was with his brother Robert. And I felt that that was his true love object. The mother was like a cartoon figure, opening the window to the garden and saying, "I made biscuits for your little friend and you. I want you to eat them." And Robert would say, "Thank you, Mother, we're not very hungry right now."
There's a lovely story which Yayoi Kusama tells about when they were in the garden together under the quince tree,
Yes.
kissing, which is as far as Cornell, I mean, that was seismic for him in terms of, and the mother comes around the corner with a bucket of iced water. I mean, you talk about cartoon character, and she empties the bucket of ice water over her son to cool him down because of what he's feeling for this young woman, and it was a very tough thing. Just to say it very quickly, Meet Joy, 1964. You've known Cornell for about 8 years. You correspond with him. Some of the letters are at the Getty now in Los Angeles. Many people say that he was much warmer and more open. I mean, we have a beautiful letter behind us to Dorothea Tanning, the wife of Max Ernst. He himself said that he was able to express himself in letters in a far more wholesome and honest and entire way than he ever could face to face. Did you find that also in your correspondence with him, that he was a bit...
You know, the correspondence could vary from extreme, fragile, sentimental wishes that might be a perfume sachet attached to a ribbon in an envelope, to long letters, handwritten, with confessional mysteries in them, letters about culture and good wishes for my work as he began to have some awareness of it, but then he would tend to pull back. He was also very disturbed when he would call me for one of our long conversations if Jim Tenney, my partner, answered the phone.
He didn't like the idea of you sharing your life with somebody else.
Having a relationship with a male, and so he would always say something like, "Is Miss Schneemann there, Mr. Tenney?"
So there was a formality to that.
Extreme formality and like a blocking, but he knew from brackets many things about our friendship and our work.
So in 1964, you go to Paris, where Meet Joy is performed for the first time.
Yeah.
And Cornell he wires you some money.
No.
No.
No, he says he would like to, but he does.
Oh, really? Because it's always written as he sends you $250 and it saves your bacon and it helps you.
Oh.
So he offers to.
Who has that information?
It's in Cornell's biography. That he keeps you in baguettes and cheese for a while in Paris through this. So someone takes credit for this wonderful act of generosity. But there's a letter from you written from Paris, which is you can read on the microfiche from the Getty, where you at least thank him for the idea of sending you some money. And if it wouldn't be too much of a hardship to him, you would be really, really grateful. So there was a slight sense of kind of mentoring or the support of an older artist for what you were doing, even if Meet Joy, I mean, he didn't come to see it when it was at the Judson.
Oh, no.
Did he, I mean, how did he respond to a work like this? This must have, on the one hand, been absolutely fascinating for him, and on the other hand, so alien to him and his stillness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how was he responding to the first really performative, visceral works when you moved away from painting and from
I don't think he knew that much about it. It was more suggestive information. And the most modest version of a photograph that would give him a sense of what I was trying to do, but not making it very explicit enough to disturb him. I respected his need for a psychic space that was fearful and subtle and had to be carefully nurtured. It had to have clouds and music and birds and subtle mental engagement that could wander on itself without strong intrusions.
And how much did you see of him from when you realized that he didn't really need a studio assistant and you were never really going to be the studio assistant for him, and when your own career began to gather momentum, how often, there was a period then of about 8 or 9 years before he died, were you often in Utopia Parkway to visit him, or did you go? No, this was more a correspondence that was
correspondence and on the phone, and the conversations and their timing had to be determined by Joseph. It was, every now and then I could make the right phone call, but it was too uncertain. But when I had a phone call from Joseph, I knew he had a realm of discussion, and it could be anything from little bits of fabric to something at the bakery to a huge analysis of a dark fairy tale. And these conversations were wonderful and very inspiring.
It's funny, I didn't really think there were very many connections between Cornell and Lucian Freud, who was our last artist that we showed in this room 2 years ago in this modern program. But the more you're talking, the more I realize that these two men have got so much in common. Lucian Freud would never, no one had Lucian Freud's telephone number. No one, even, I mean, he had 36 children and 34 of them didn't have their father's telephone number.
Well, he wasn't sexually phobic.
Cornell was, Freud was very much the opposite.
Yeah.
But he was also fascinated by having lots of young girls around the studio and they would never meet. So a girl would come into the studio at 2 o'clock at the time and she'd sit down on a mattress and it would be warm. So she would know that someone else had just been there for their portrait and so on. Anyway.
Yes.
Since he died in 1972, I mean, success came to him quite late. I mean, he was showing already at MoMA in the 1930s and so on, but he was having these big museum retrospectives just before he died at the Guggenheim in New York, in Pasadena, in California. Were you aware in New York in circles that this was, you know, he was getting visits every day from Andy Warhol, James Rosenquist, Walter de Maria, they were all in the studio. Were you aware towards the end of Cornell's life that he was becoming more of a focal point for a younger generation of artists and his importance was increasing somewhat?
Somewhat. It was wonderful and amazing, but there was a hiatus because I was in London with a torn apart life structure of my own from 1969 to 74. So those were the years when Cornell was really entering our cultural history again, and I wasn't there.
Right.
Yeah.
And since he died, how much contact have you had with the work? I mean, you get asked to do something like this every so often. Is Cornell, do you live with something at home, a little keepsake or something? Or?
Oh yeah, yes, I have some little magic objects that I kept that Joseph made for me, but the main work that he was going to dedicate it to me was a collage of Ribera's daughter. So it was about the painter's daughter who was a painter herself. And I was longing to have the piece, and I don't know whatever became of it. I was certainly too shy to call him and say, Joseph, where's the work for me?
And when he gave you something, because you often hear about people who received things from Cornell, and some of them, you know, he would wait outside the stage door for dancers and singers when they would leave the stage, and he would ask them for their hairpin or some sequins from their dress, and a week later he would come back with a little thing which had the hairpin and the sequins in it.
Yeah.
And some people were completely freaked out by his warmth and generosity. Lauren Bacall, for example, the actor, when she discovered that he was collecting a dossier all about her, she nearly called the police. She thought it was the gifts that he gave to you were a very kind of natural part of the friendship. They didn't, because a lot of people were quite disturbed by the stories of people giving things back to Cornell because they were just...
Well, these were always such fragile, subtle, little, seemingly valueless gifts. That might be what had alarmed them, was that they couldn't give it a real definition in terms of what was the commercialization of this feeling behind the gift. A hat pin, for heaven's sakes, or sachet that was only as big as your thumb. You had to be in that poetic sensibility, and then it was thrilling. So mostly I received letters, cards, little sachets, once a tiny box with tiny horses in it. Mostly letters, and then I made a work I did make an homage called Moon on a Tree when he had died, and I took our letters and photographed them so that they could be projected with images I had of Joseph, and then a parallel vocabulary of works by Brackage and myself from the time. So it was a conversation of 3 projected images.
And in this piece, I think this was first performed in around 1976 at the Anthology Film Archives. You have it here.
Let's see.
I think it was around 76.
You're right, it says so right here, yeah.
And you're sitting at a little picnic table
Yes.
in the piece, as if you were sitting in Cornell's garden under the quince tree.
And I'm wearing a little cotton flowered dress, which he really liked, a little floaty thing.
And there's a photograph by Hans Namuth of Cornell projected as if he's sitting at the table with you.
No, but as if his spirit is embodied with the projection. Yeah.
And how was the response to this piece? I was really hoping I would see it in Salzburg, but you told me earlier that it's not part of the exhibition there. But how was the response to this piece at the time that you made it?
Well, the response was appreciative, respectful, subtle, but it had no grip. It had no grip in the context of all my work or in the retrieval of the meanings of Cornell.
I'm going to maybe open it up and ask somebody else here if they might have a question, Carolee. Would somebody like to ask something? I have one more question, but I thought it might be nice for anyone else. No? You've satisfied everybody.
It's what? We should ask for a very simple, stupid question, because those are useful.
Yeah. Do we have a really stupid question?
Something really stupid, like how long did the subway ride take from New York to Queens?
Tell us about this amazing house in Utopia Parkway where he lived. I mean, there are not many artists alive in the world who could say that every single artwork they produced was produced in one single location. That's quite unique.
Yeah.
How was the house? Was it utterly dominated by the mother? It
was a very oppressive, conventional. It had a morbid feeling because Robert was the dynamic center, but that wasn't a public aspect of Cornell's life. And that involved feeding him, moving him, his wheelchair, his toilet, bits of food, and giving Robert papers and pencils because Joseph really adored any kind of mark making that Robert would make. He felt that he was a wonderful artist, despite his handicap. It was a very bourgeois, none of us would want to live there. Yes.
When Cornell's brother died, which was a couple of years before Cornell himself died, Leo Castelli, the dealer in New York, asked for an exhibition of Cornell's work. And Cornell said, I will only do an exhibition of my work if I can show my brother's work as well. Mm-hmm. So he showed these sort of very childlike drawings of rabbits. And I think the rabbit is a motif which occurs again and again. And they exhibited, it was an exhibition of Joseph and Robert Cornell at the Leo Castelli Gallery. And every New York critic only wrote about Cornell's work and completely ignored Robert. But they also made a few collaborative works, which are interesting.
Well, their life was really collaborative in its invisible constancy. Joseph had no life apart from Robert's. Yeah.
Carolee, before we stop talking, I would just like, I think a few of the wonderful people here were in Salzburg with you on Saturday for the opening. For those of us who weren't, and who will be going to see the exhibition soon, could you just say a couple of words about what you've been doing for the last years, what there is to see in Salzburg, because we're all lazy here and we need a kick up the backside to get on the train and go and see it, because it's going to be something really fabulous.
Yeah, it's very fabulous. I'm an ecstatic artist for the first time ever. My body of work has a full context, it's coherent, it's intensive. It starts with childhood drawings from when I'm 4 years old, and these are predictive of my need for motion and energy, and they're crude little things, but it ends then 2 floors of film, video, collage, objects, pieces that have motors in them, and the most recent installation that's called Flange, a section of motorized, moving sculptural parts that were made originally from lost wax process and then burnt in the foundry, poured into aluminum. There's a computer chip that drives the motors and a projection of the foundry burning itself. So you enter this full sculptural installation that both presents and describes itself. In between, there are very rare installations, mortal coils, a rope that was shown here once about 10 years ago, dedicated to images of dead friends being projected through space. What else, Andy? Help. Devour, a very important video installation that is 2 full screens with smaller monitor units, which juxtaposes ordinary domestic life with violence of people being murdered, and images from Sarajevo, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Haiti, juxtaposed with the most simple images from daily life of baby suckling, someone eating spaghetti, people walking in a park eating hot dogs. What else? The films, thank you, yeah, there's several rooms of films. There are films projected in a wonderful installation of floating screens. It's amazing, and there's a terrific catalog. Yeah, it's the most comprehensive presentation of my work that's ever been attempted and achieved, and I thank Sabine Breitwasser for this dedication and fierce determination to make it happen.
And we hope it's going to travel.
Yeah, we hope so.
I think it needs to. It looks like it was so much work. I just went through the catalogue before. Everything looks like it was made about 5 minutes ago. That's the biggest compliment I can give you. It feels extremely...
And well, that's such a huge compliment, because most of this work has been systematically and chronologically neglected for over 40, 45 years. And here now, I feel a little bewildered. It has so much appreciation.
And there's a lovely major work which MoMA have just acquired, which was from 1963, which you said has been sitting, Carolee said had been sitting in her shed since 1963.
Being gnawed and chewed on by raccoons, mice, birds, and the local appreciators.
Well, it's amazing, and it's found a good home now.
Yeah.
It's 7:55. very aware of the fact that you've had a totally exhausting last few days, and so I'm going to leave you in your armchair. No, we're all exhausted. We had a busy week in Vienna last week, but nothing compared to you. I'm going to wrap it up, but the exhibition will be open till 9 o'clock. I'm going to ask you all one favor, which is, can you pick up your chair and take it outside the front door of the exhibition and just pop it down outside? Because then we can enjoy the exhibition without any chairs in here. That would be great. They're very light. Oh, wrong. Oh, please leave your chairs exactly where they are. We can apparently afford people to do that for you. So,
Jasper, I want to thank you for this exquisite exhibit. Joseph would love this. It's so in his spirit, in the lighting, in the proportion, in the density, in the thoughtfulness of the juxtapositions. It's beautiful. It's as magic as Joseph was.
Thank you. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you all very much for coming. And Carolee, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much.